On the morning of September 3rd, 1933, a man named Cecil Doss drove his truck down a county road in Eastland County, Texas, and did not come back. He was 31 years old. He had a wife, 3 children, a farm that had been in the Doss family since 1891. He drove the same road. He drove every morning. He did not come back. Eastland County sits in north-central Texas, in a region called the Cross Timbers, a name that tells you something about the place, which is country that can't quite decide what it is. Not the open plains to the west, not the piney woods to the east. Something between. Post oak and blackjack, oak scrub interrupted by patches of open grassland, limestone outcroppings, red clay that turns to mud in the rain, and cracks to powder in the drought. By 1933, the drought had been running for 2 years. The Dust Bowl was arriving. Not in the catastrophic way it would arrive in the western panhandle. Eastland County was spared the worst of the black blizzards, but in the patient, grinding way that drought in Texas works. Crops failing, wells dropping, cattle selling for nothing because everyone was selling and nobody was buying. Bank loans coming due on farms that couldn't produce the cash to service them. The county seat was Cisco. Cisco had been famous once, briefly. In 1927, a man dressed as Santa Claus had robbed the First National Bank, there in what the newspapers called a Santa Claus bank robbery, which was the kind of story that put a town on the map for the wrong reasons. By 1933, the bank was gone. The oil boom that flared in the county in the 1920s had gone quiet. What remained was the land and the people on it, and the particular dignity of people who are losing ground and have decided that losing it with their head up is the only thing still in their control in this county. In this year, 2 families have been living as neighbors since before either of them could fully remember when it started. The Doss family had been there since 1891, a Reconstruction-era migration from East Texas, a family that had come west following the land grants and the promise of something better, and had found something harder, but had stayed anyway. By 1933, they were in their 3rd generation on the same section of land, farming cotton and running a few cattle, and doing what Cross Timbers families did to get through years that tested everything. The Mackeys had arrived a decade later, 1902, from Oklahoma Territory. They had settled the adjoining section to the north of the Doss land, and the 2 families had shared, for 30 years, a fence line and a water tank, and the kind of relationship that comes from 3 decades of proximity in a sparsely populated county, where your nearest neighbor is the only neighbor you've got. The relationship had been functional, not warm. Neither family was given warmth as a social performance, but functional. They had helped each other during the bad cattle years of 1917. They had worked the same harvest when labor was short. Their children had gone to the same one-room schoolhouse 6 miles down the road, and they had shared, for 30 years, a fence line that had never been surveyed properly. In 1932, a county surveyor came through Eastland County on a state road project and ran lines on several properties as a side effect of the work. He ran the line between the Doss and Mackey sections. He found a discrepancy. The discrepancy was 11 acres. 11 acres of cross timber scrubland that had, for 30 years, sat on the Mackey side of an assumed fence line and had been worked as Mackey land, part of a pasture where Mackey cattle graze, cleared and maintained at Mackey expense. The survey said the fence was wrong. The survey said those 11 acres, under the original 1891 land grant, were Doss property. 11 acres of scrub pasture in Eastland County in 1933 was not worth a great deal in any absolute sense. The land market had collapsed with everything else. If you tried to sell it, you get almost nothing. But if you were farming in 1933 and losing ground to the drought and watching your cattle shrink from too little water and too little grass, 11 acres of pasture was not nothing. It was the difference between a herd that had enough and a herd that didn't. Franklin Doss, Cecil's father, 64 years old, the patriarch of the family, went to see Harlan Mackey about the survey. Franklin Doss was a man who had spent 64 years in Eastland County, Texas, which meant he had spent 64 years developing the specific personality that Eastland County, Texas produced in people who stayed in it. He was not a demonstrative man. He was not a forgiving man. He was not a man who wasted words or motion or patience on anything he decided was not worth the expenditure. He believed the 11 acres were his. He went to Harlan Mackey's house on a Thursday in October 1932, in the fall, when the harvest was in and the worst of the summer heat had broken, and there was, in the air of the crossed timbers, the specific quality of a place that has survived another difficult year and is not yet sure what the next one will bring. Harlan Mackey was 61 years old. He had come to Eastland County from Oklahoma Territory as a young man and had built his operation across 30 years with the specific competence of someone who had arrived with little and made more of it than the land easily allowed. He was proud of what he had built. He was proud in a way that makes a man resistant to the suggestion that any part of what he has built was built on someone else's property. Franklin laid out the survey. Harlan looked at it. He said the survey was wrong. Franklin said the survey was the survey. Harlan said his family had been working that land for 30 years. Franklin said 30 years of working, it didn't make it Mackey land if the deed said Doss. Harlan said he would get his own surveyor. Franklin said he could do what he wanted, but the land was Doss land and the fence was going to move. He left. Harlan Mackey watched him go. He did not call a surveyor. He called his sons. Harlan had 2 sons, Cecil. Not the same Cecil as Cecil Doss. This is one of the places where the names of story create confusion, and it is worth slowing down to establish clearly that there were 2 Cecils, one on each side. Cecil Mackey, 34 years old, and Earl Mackey, 30, who had come back from a stint in the oil fields in 1931, when the work dried up, and had been back on the family land for 2 years with the specific restlessness of a man who has been somewhere else and returned to somewhere smaller. Franklin Doss had 2 sons as well. Cecil Doss, 31, the one who drove the road on the morning of September 3rd, 1933, and George Doss, 27, who worked the farm alongside his brother and who was, by the account of people who knew both brothers, the more even-tempered of the 2, which in the Doss family was a relative distinction. 4 young men, 2 families, 11 acres, and a drought that was making everything smaller and harder and less forgiving than it had been the year before. The year between Franklin's visit to Harlan Mackey and the morning of September 3rd, 1933 was a year that Eastland County remembered for what it revealed about what people will do when they have nothing left to lose and something left to fight about. Franklin Doss moved the fence in November 1932. He and his son spent 3 days pulling posts and running new wire along the surveyed line. It was legal. It was within their rights. It was also, in the context of 30 years of assumed arrangement and the specific volatility of 2 families already under drought pressure, a declaration. Harlan Mackey rode out and watched them do it. He did not interfere. He watched. He went home. 3 weeks later, the new fence was cut. Not just cut, pulled. Posts pulled from the ground. Wire rolled up and left in a pile on the Doss side where the old line had been. The fence, effectively unmade. Franklin Doss drove out in the morning and found it. He rebuilt it. It was cut again. He rebuilt it again, this time with heavier wire and set posts in concrete. It was cut again, and 2 posts were pulled from the concrete and left in the creek bed. This went on for 3 months. November, December, January. The winter of 1932 to 33, which was cold in a dry way. No snow to speak of, just gray sky and dead grass and the specific desolation of a Texas winter that has nothing to offer. 3 months of fence. Every cut of communication. Every rebuild a response. The Eastland County Sheriff was aware of the situation by December 1932. The Doss family had reported the fence cutting twice. The sheriff, a man named Purvis, who had been in the job for 8 years and who knew both families and knew exactly what he was dealing with, had driven out and looked at the fence and spoken to Franklin Doss and driven to the Mackey property and spoken to Harlan. He had told both of them that the fence cutting was a crime and that it needed to stop. Harlan Mackey had said he didn't know anything about any fence cutting. The fence was cut again the following week. Sheriff Purvis wrote a report and filed it. He drove out twice more through the winter, each time producing the same result. Harlan Mackey not knowing anything. The fence getting cut anyway. In February 1933, Cecil Doss, Franklin's older son, drove to the Mackey property without his father's knowledge and confronted Earl Mackey in the yard. The confrontation was physical. Earl Mackey came out of it worse than Cecil Doss. Cecil drove home with a cut on his forehead and the specific look. His wife later said of a man who had done something that felt necessary and not quite right simultaneously. He told his father what he had done. Franklin Doss was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Don't do that again without telling me first," which was not an objection to what Cecil had done, which was an instruction about coordination. The spring of 1933 brought no rain. The county extension agent drove the roads in March and April and wrote reports that were models of understated disaster. Crop prospects poor, pasture conditions critical, water table at record lows. The language of agricultural bureaucracy, wrapping around the plain fact that the land was failing and the people on it were running out of options. The Mackey cattle had less grass than they needed. The contested 11 acres, now fenced on the Doss side with concrete posts and heavy wire, would have helped. Without them, the herd was short. Earl Mackey looked at that fence every day. He looked at the cattle on the other side of it, on land he had worked for 30 years, grazing on the little grass that was left. He said things to his brother Cecil Mackey that Cecil Mackey later declined to repeat in any official context. He drove the county roads at night, which people noticed without commenting on. He was building towards something. The only question was what shape it was going to take. Franklin Doss was 64 years old in 1933, which in Eastland County, Texas, in the middle of the Great Depression, was not quite old age, but was the beginning of the territory where a man starts to understand that what he has built is what there is, that the time for building more is probably behind him, and the time for protecting what exists is now. He had built the Doss section across 40 years, had come to it as a young man, 24 years old, following his father who had filed on a land grant and then died before he could work it, leaving Franklin with 640 acres of cross-timber scrub and a mortgage on equipment to work it and the choice between walking away and staying. He had stayed. He had stayed through the drought of 1917, which had been bad, through the cattle price collapse of 1920, which had been worse, through the 20s, which had been neither good nor bad in Eastland County, in the way they were good in the cities. Just steady, careful, the specific kind of moderate prosperity that the cross timbers offered to people who worked it without illusion. He had stayed and he had built it, and by 1932, the year the surveyor came, the Doss section was a functioning operation. 60 head of cattle, a cotton allotment, a farmhouse that was plain but sound, 3 hired hands in good years, none in bad ones. It was his. All of it was his. And then the surveyor ran his line and found those 11 acres on the Mackey side of the fence that had been in the wrong place for 30 years. And Franklin Doss had looked at the survey map and felt something that was not exactly anger and not exactly vindication, but somewhere between the two. The feeling of a man who has always suspected something was wrong and has finally been told in official language that he was right. He went to Harlan Mackey. He was not angry when he went. He was matter of fact. He presented the survey. He expected a conversation that reasonable men have when a survey reveals a boundary error. The acknowledgement, the negotiation, the adjustment. What he got instead was Harlan Mackey telling him the survey was wrong. Franklin Doss drove home. He moved the fence. What Franklin Doss thought about Harlan Mackey across the decades of their coexistence was a private matter that he had never made public. They had been neighbors for 30 years. They had helped each other when help was needed. They had managed their shared fence line and their shared water tank and the ordinary friction of adjacent operations in the cross timbers with a specific minimum of goodwill that 2 men who need each other more than they want are capable of maintaining. But Franklin had never, if you asked the people who knew him, fully trusted Harlan Mackey. This was not an articulated position. It was a disposition. The specific wariness of a man who has watched someone for a long time and has noticed certain things about how they operate and has filed those things away without acting on them. When the survey came back and the fence was wrong and Harlan's first response was to say the survey was wrong rather than let me look at that or we should talk about this. Franklin Doss understood, in a particular way that a man understands when a long-held suspicion is confirmed, exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. He moved the fence. He kept moving it every time it was cut. And when his son was found in the creek bed on September 4th, he stood at the edge of that creek bed and did not make a sound, and everyone who was there that morning said the same thing about him afterward, that the silence was the most frightening thing, that a man who should have been destroyed was instead completely still, in the way that things are still when they have found their center of gravity. He had found his. What he was going to do with it was the only question remaining. Earl Mackey had come back from the oil fields in 1931 with calloused hands and a disappointed quality that his family had learned to work around. He had gone to the Permian Basin in 1928 at age 25, following the oil boom that was pulling young men from the cross timbers with promises of wages that farming couldn't match. He had worked a drilling crew for 3 years. He had made reasonable money. He had sent some home and spent the rest in Midland and Odessa on the things young men with money and no family nearby spend money on. When the Depression hit the oil fields in 1930 and 1931, the crews shrank fast. Earl was among the men let go in the second round of cuts. He drove back to Eastland County with what was left, not much, and took up his place on the Mackey section, as if he had simply resumed a chapter of his life that had been interrupted. But he had not simply resumed it. He had been somewhere else. He had seen a version of the world that was different from the cross timbers, and coming back to the cross timbers after that, coming back to drought and the falling cattle prices and the shrinking options and the fence line that had been in the same place his whole life, was an experience that sat on him with a specific weight that he managed less well than he managed most things. His brother Cecil Mackey was the steadier of the two. Cecil had never left. Cecil had worked the section alongside their father through the boom years and into the Depression years, and had developed, through continuity, the specific equanimity of a man who has accepted that this is his life and has made his peace with it. Earl had not made his peace with it. He was 30 years old in 1932 when the fence dispute began, and he was not looking for a fight exactly, but not looking away from one either. The fence dispute arrived into that specific availability and found a home in it. He cut the fence the first time alone at night, without telling his father or his brother. He used wire cutters that he kept in the truck for general fence maintenance, and drove to the disputed section after dark, and cut it in 4 places and drove home. He slept well that night. In retrospect, this was a problem, because the cutting that felt like action, like a response, like doing something about a situation that was otherwise grinding him down, the cutting felt right. It felt like the only form available to him of saying no. And when it produced a result, when the Doss family rebuilt the fence and the cutting had to happen again and again and again, it didn't occur to Earl Mackey that he was in a cycle rather than a solution. It occurred to him that the cycle was the point. That persistence was the argument. He persisted, right up to the moment that Cecil Doss was found in the creek bed. And then, and this is the detail that the people who knew the situation found hardest to understand, in the years after, Earl Mackey went quiet, immediately and completely quiet. The restlessness, the specific displaced energy that had been cutting fence lines and driving county roads at night, stopped, as if the thing that had been propelling him had suddenly run out of fuel. Whether the quietness was guilt, whether Earl Mackey knew exactly what had happened to Cecil Doss, and what his own role in the sequence of events had been, is a question that Earl Mackey carried to his grave without answering. Sheriff Purvis believed he knew. The county believed it knew. Earl Mackey said nothing. He was quiet through the investigation. He was quiet through the fall. He was quiet on the night of October 14th, when Franklin Doss found him in the barn. He was quiet afterward. That particular quiet lasted the rest of his life. Vera Doss was 28 years old when her husband did not come back from Cisco. She had been married to Cecil for 8 years. She had come to the Doss section as a 20-year-old bride from a family in Palo Pinto County, one county to the east, and had spent 8 years building the specific life that the cross timbers offered, not easy but real. Cecil was a good husband in the way that men in these communities were good husbands, present, hard-working, not expressive in the ways that romance novels described, but steady in the ways that mattered. He came home. He worked. He did not drink more than was ordinary. He was kind to the children. He drove south on September 3rd and did not come back. Vera waited at the farmhouse with 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 2, while her father-in-law drove the county road looking. She fed the children supper. She put them to bed. She sat in the kitchen after they were asleep and waited in the specific way that you wait when you already know, somewhere in a place below reasoning, that the thing you are waiting for is not going to arrive. She did not sleep. Franklin came to the house at 10 that night and told her he had found the truck and not Cecil. She looked at her father-in-law's face and understood what his face was communicating even though he had not said it. She nodded. She made him coffee. They sat in the kitchen through the night. In the morning, a deputy came to the house. Vera Doss raised 3 children alone on the Doss section for 4 years after September 1933. She had Franklin's help and George's help, and the help of neighbors who understood that a widow in the cross timbers was a woman who needed the community and who the community owed. In 1937, she married again, a man named Hutchins from Cisco, a good man, a steady man, a man who was not Cecil but who was present and who was kind to the children, and who gave her something she had not had since that morning. Certainly that the person who drove away in the morning would come back. She moved to Cisco. She left the Doss section to Franklin and George. She visited Franklin until he died in 1951. She sat with him in the last months, when he was sick, and they talked about Cecil in the way that people talk about someone who's been gone long enough that the talking is a comfort rather than a wound. She died in 1979 at the age of 74. Her children, Cecil's children, grew up in Cisco and became ordinary people in the specific way that the children of tragedy become ordinary people, by doing what needs doing, by moving forward, by not sending tragedy without denying it. The youngest was 2 years old in September 1933. He grew up not knowing his father. He grew up knowing the outline of what had happened. He grew up and had children of his own and told them, when they were old enough, that their grandfather had been a good man who died young on a county road in a dispute over 11 acres of scrubland in the middle of the Depression. He told them the outline. He did not tell them about the barn. Some things you keep. Cecil Doss left his house at 6:45 in the morning on September 3rd, 1933. His wife, a woman named Vera, watched him from a kitchen window as he got into his truck. She later said there was nothing unusual about the morning. He had eaten breakfast. He had spoken to the children. He had said he would be back by noon. He drove south on the county road. He was in a Cisco, a supply run, picking up wire and fence staples, the ordinary maintenance of a farm that was always needing something. He did not reach Cisco. He did not come back by noon. By 2 o'clock, Vera Doss was at her father-in-law's house. Franklin drove the county road himself. He found the truck at a pull-off 3 miles south of the Doss property. Engine off. Door open. Cecil's hat on the ground beside it. No Cecil. He was found the following morning by a neighbor in a dry creek bed 200 yards off the road. He had been shot twice. He was 31 years old. He left a wife, 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 2, and a father who stood at the edge of that creek bed and looked at his son and did not make a sound. Sheriff Purvis had a murder. He had a body in a creek bed with 2 bullet wounds. He had a family that had been in an active property dispute with their neighbors for 11 months. He had a county that was watching and waiting and already talking, in the specific way of small counties, about who had done it and why. What he did not have was evidence. He brought Earl Mackey in for questioning on September 5th. Earl said he had been home on the evening of September 2nd. His brother Cecil Mackey said the same. Their mother said the same. Their father Harlan said the same. Nobody else had seen Earl Mackey on the county road that morning. The road had been empty. The drought had kept people close to their properties. And a specific section of county road where Cecil Doss's truck was found was not a heavily traveled stretch. Purvis held Earl for 48 hours and released him. He brought him in again 2 weeks later. Same result. The Doss family knew who had done it. Sheriff Purvis believed he knew who had done it. The county believed it knew who had done it. What nobody had was something that could make the knowing into a prosecution. The investigation ran to the fall of 1933 and into 1934 without producing an arrest. It was classified as open/unsolved. It remained that way. Franklin Doss did not wait for the investigation. He understood, with the understanding of a man who had lived 64 years in Eastland County, that the investigation was a process with its own timeline and its own logic, and that its conclusions might or might not align with what he already knew to be true. He made his own calculation. George Doss, Cecil's younger brother, 27 years old, later said that his father, in the weeks after Cecil's murder, became a different kind of man, not louder, not more agitated. The opposite. He became very quiet, very still. He stopped going to church. He stopped going to town except when necessary. He sat on the porch in the evenings and looked at the fence line to the north, at the Mackey land, and he was doing something in that looking that George recognized and was frightened of. He was deciding. George said, I tried to talk to him. I told him that Sheriff Purvis was still working on it, that we needed to let the law handle it. Franklin said, the law is handling it the way the law handles things. George said, what does that mean? Franklin said, it means it'll take as long as it takes and come out however it comes out, and none of that is about Cecil. George said, Papa, don't. Franklin looked at his younger son. He said, go home to your wife. George went home. He did not sleep that night, on the night of October 14th, 1933. 41 days after his son was found in the creek bed, Franklin Doss drove north on the county road. He was 64 years old. He had been in Eastland County since before any of the Mackeys arrived. He had built what the Doss family had by the same slow accumulation of labor and weather and stubbornness that the cross timbers required of everyone who stayed in it. He had buried a son. He parked his truck on a farm road a quarter-mile from the Mackey property. He walked the rest of the way in the dark, which he could do without difficulty because he'd been walking this land for 40 years and knew every rock and wash and fence post of it in full daylight, and most of them in darkness. Earl Mackey was in the barn. The details of what happened in the barn that night were never fully established in any official record, because the only witness was Franklin Doss, and Franklin Doss did not produce an official record of it. What is in the official record is this. Harlan Mackey found his son Earl in the barn on the morning of October 15th. Earl was alive. He had injuries consistent with a severe beating. He had a broken left arm, for broken ribs, a broken orbital bone around his left eye, and injuries to his midsection that took 3 months to fully heal. He was alive. Franklin Doss had left him alive. Whether this was mercy or message, whether Franklin had decided that death was not what he was there for, or whether he had decided that death would bring consequences he was not prepared to face, or whether he had simply stopped when he stopped and the stopping was its own answer, is not known. What is known is that Earl Mackey survived, and that Franklin Doss drove home in the dark, and washed, and went to sleep, and was in his field at 6 the following morning when George arrived. George looked at his father's hands. He didn't say anything. Franklin didn't say anything. They worked. Sheriff Purvis came to the Doss property on October 16th. He sat across from Franklin at the kitchen table. He looked at Franklin for a long time. He said, Earl Mackey is in the hospital. Franklin said, I heard. Purvis said, he says he doesn't know who did it. Franklin looked at the sheriff. He said, seems to be going around. Purvis looked at him for another long moment. He said, Franklin, I can't keep doing this. Franklin said, you've been doing what you can, Eldon. I know that. Purvis said, I need you to tell me this is over. Franklin Doss looked at the county road through the kitchen window. The fence line was visible from where he sat. The 11 acres of scrub pasture, brown and dry, on the Doss side now. He said, it's over. Purvis looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stood up. He put on his hat. He drove away to IT was, in the way that these things are sometimes over. The Mackey family did not respond to what had happened to Earl. Harlan Mackey was 62 years old, and his son was in the hospital, and whatever calculation he had been making across the previous year had, in the barn on the night of October 14th, reached a conclusion. He did not go to the sheriff. Earl did not go to the sheriff. Cecil Mackey said nothing. The fence line stayed where the survey had placed it. The 11 acres remained Doss land. Earl Mackey healed, mostly. The left arm was not entirely right afterward. Something in the elbow had not set correctly and gave him trouble in the cold years. He worked his father's land for another decade, until Harlan died in 1944, and then sold the Mackey section to a man from Abilene who ran cattle on it. He moved to Abilene. He did not speak to any recorded account about what had happened in the barn. He died in 1971. Franklin Doss lived until 1951. He was 82 years old. He died in the same house he had lived in since 1891. In the Cross Timbers country he had never left, on land that the fence survey had confirmed as his. He had outlived Cecil by 18 years. He had outlived Harlan Mackey by 7. George Doss, the younger son, the one who had said don't and had not been listened to and had gone home and not slept, ran the farm after Franklin's health declined. He sold it in 1963 to a family from Fort Worth that turned it to a cattle operation. George moved to Mineral Wells. He was interviewed once, in 1967, by a reporter working on a piece about Depression-era land disputes in North Texas. He spoke about the fence, about the survey, about the drought. He did not speak about September 3rd or October 14th. The reporter noted that he had seemed, for a man in his 60s discussing events from 30 years prior, unusually composed, as if the composure had been built over a very long time and maintained at a cost that had become, by now, simply the ordinary cost of being George Doss. The reporter's piece ran in a Fort Worth paper. It mentioned the Doss Mackey land dispute in 2 paragraphs. It did not mention Cecil. It did not mention the barn. Some things the papers knew not to print. George Doss died in 1978. He was the last person alive who had known all of it. When he died, the knowing went with him. Eastland County is still there. The cross timber scrub is still there. The post oak and the blackjack, the limestone outcroppings, the red clay that the rain still finds twice a year, and the sun bakes dry again by June. The drought of the 1930s is long over. Though Eastland County knows drought the way it knows summer, as a recurring condition, a feature of the landscape rather than a deviation from it. The section that was Doss land as a cattle operation now has been for decades run by people who have no connection to the families in this story and who know nothing about a fence line and a survey and a dry September morning in 1933. The section that was Mackey land is the same. The fence between them is a modern fence. Steel posts, barbed wire, maintained by whoever has the contract this year. It runs along the surveyed line. It runs where Franklin Doss put in the fall of 1932 and rebuilt it through the winter and kept rebuilding it until the cutting stopped. It runs there still. Cecil Doss is buried in the Baptist Church Cemetery in Cisco. His stone has his name, his dates, and the words beloved husband and father. The stone is weathered. The dates are still readable. The creek bed where he was found is dry most years. The scrub oak around it is the same scrub oak it has always been. There is nothing there to mark what happened. There was never anything there to mark it. These are the stories that don't get markers. The ones that happened in the in-between country, on the fence lines, on the roads between farms and counties that the history books visit briefly and move on from. They happen. They shape people. The people are gone. The land remains. Cecil Doss, Eastland County, Texas. September 3rd, 1933. 31 years old. 3 children. A farm that was his father's. A road he drove every morning. He did not come back.